we turn to Romans chapter 13, a chapter that can be challenging, especially in the world we live in today. We see Paul clearly instructs believers to obey governing authorities. This is not an easy command, let's be honest, particularly when those in power abuse their authority. Paul is not naive about this reality, and neither is Scripture. God does not approve of corruption, injustice, or oppression. Paul explains that governing authorities are meant to uphold justice, and as Christians, we are called to obey the law, pay taxes, and show respect to those in authority. It is important to remember the historical context. The Roman Empire was not friendly toward Christians or toward Jewish people. They were heavily taxed, often mistreated, and had very little legal protection. Yet, Paul still instructed believers to honor governing authorities. Even Jesus addressed this issue in Luke 20, verse 20 through 26. When asked about paying taxes, Jesus made it clear that people were to give to Caesar what belonged to Caesar, and to God what belonged to God. This showed that honoring earthly authority does not replace devotion to God. It exists alongside it. Scripture also reminds us that God is ultimately the one who establishes governing authorities. We see this clearly throughout the Bible, including in Daniel and the Psalms, where God is described as the one who raises up rulers and brings them down. This does not mean that God approves of ungodly or corrupt leadership. Rather, throughout the Old Testament, we see God using even unrighteous rulers to accomplish his purposes and to bring his people back into obedience. Those in authority, whether good or evil, will be held accountable for their actions. God sees injustice. He is a righteous judge, and he will act in his time. The Psalms and the prophets consistently reminds us that the wicked do not escape God's notice. When we obey governing authorities as believers, we can trust that God will deal with them according to his perfect justice. Paul then addresses very practical matters. In Romans 13, verse 6 through 7, he instructs believers to pay taxes, show respect, and give honor where it is due. He writes, "This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, continually attending to these tasks. Pay your obligations to everyone, taxes to those you owe taxes, tolls to those you owe tolls, respect to those you owe respect, and honor to those you owe honor." This is not conditional on whether the authority is fair or likable. It is rooted in trust that God remains sovereign even when human systems fail. However, Paul makes something very clear throughout Scripture. Our ultimate allegiance belongs to God. If a governing authority commands something that directly contradicts God's will, obedience to God must take precedence. The apostles declared this plainly in Acts 5 verse 29, saying, "We must obey God rather than people." Throughout the Bible, we see examples of faithful believers who honored God, even when it came at great personal cost. Esther, Daniel and his friends, the parents of Moses, and others who chose obedience to God over submission to unjust commands. Submission to authority is not blind obedience. It is obedience rooted in faithfulness to God first. Paul then turns our attention to the heart of God's law, love. Love fulfills the law. God's commandments were given to protect us. And when we love others, we naturally fulfill what the law requires. This is exactly what Christ did on the cross. He fulfilled the law through perfect love. Christian obedience is not driven by fear, but by love. Love for God and love for others. As Romans 13 comes to a close, Paul reminds us to live with urgency. Christ's return is closer than ever. We are called to cast off sinful behaviors and clothe ourselves with Christ. This is part of the process of sanctification. Since God is holy, we are called to walk in holiness. Our lives should reflect the reality that we belong to Christ and that we are living in anticipation of His return. While we are called to honor earthly authorities, our ultimate allegiance belongs to God alone. Love fulfills God's law. Obedience flows from faith, and believers are urged to live holy lives with urgency and purpose. As we wait for Christ's return, we live as people who respect authority, pursue righteousness, and trust the sovereignty of God, no matter the circumstances around us. Thank you for joining me today. Remember to subscribe to the channel, share the channel with all your friends, and God willing, I'll see you in the next one. Have a blessed day. Shalom, shalom.